There is a car that was still being built 38 years after it launched, not restored, not revived for a limited anniversary run, actually manufactured on an active assembly line, rolling out to buyers who needed it for real work. A car whose final unit left a production floor in Nigeria in 2006, and whose departure was mourned not by collectors but by taxi drivers and logistics coordinators who simply had no adequate replacement lined up. Europe had already held the funeral in 1983. That gap, 23 years between the farewell Europe gave it and the moment it actually stopped being made, is what this video is about. Because it isn't just automotive history, it's a story about what we decided to call progress, who that decision served, and who paid for it quietly, without being asked. The Peugeot 504. If you grew up in Britain or America in the 70s, you may remember it as that elegant French saloon in a neighbor's driveway. If you traveled in West Africa at any point across the last 5 decades, you know it differently. You know it as the vehicle, the default word. The name that stopped being a brand and became the term for the concept itself. The thing you flagged down on a dusty road when you needed to get somewhere and nothing else was coming. 2 completely different relationships with the same machine. 2 completely different verdicts, and only one of them was based on what the car could actually do when it was genuinely needed. By the end of this, you will understand why the 504 is one of the most honest pieces of engineering to come out of the 20th century motor industry. You will understand why that honesty made it nearly invisible to the Europeans who should have celebrated it loudest. And you will understand why the communities that trusted it most were never consulted when the decision was made to walk away. This is not a nostalgic review. It has a question that deserves a direct answer. And the 504 is the evidence. 1968 is not a quiet year. Paris is paralyzed by the largest general strike in French history, students and workers side by side, shutting the capital down for weeks. In America, Martin Luther King is killed in April, Robert Kennedy in June. Vietnam grinds forward with no visible end. The world is loud, fractured, and angry. And in the middle of all that noise, at the Paris Motor Show, a French car company places a family saloon on a stand under the lights. No riots about it, no front pages, just the car, waiting. The Peugeot 504 had been designed by Pininfarina, the Italian house responsible for some of the most celebrated Ferraris and Alfa Romeos ever drawn. When that same eye was applied to a mass-market family car, something unexpected emerged. Long, clean lines, proper proportions, a stance that suggested it belonged somewhere more interesting than a supermarket car park. It won European Car of the Year in 1969. Over 3 million units were produced in France before European production ended. The engineering underneath that Pininfarina body was not designed around a fantasy. Most cars are optimized for the median driver on the median road. The 504 was built for punishment. Independent rear suspension at a price point where most rivals still used rigid axles. A torque tube drive shaft enclosed in a rigid tube at both ends, relieving drivetrain stress on broken ground. High ground clearance. Long suspension travel, a body structure engineered to absorb serious impact without folding. None of that appeared in a brochure headline. It was the kind of quality that only declared itself over time, under load, on roads that had no business being called roads at all. The diesel variant, arriving in the early 1970s, deepened that philosophy. Slow by the standards of the day, nobody was boasting about it at traffic lights, but it returned fuel economy figures that made petrol alternatives look wasteful at precisely the moment the 1973 oil crisis stripped the romance out of thirsty engines across the Western world. The 504 diesel was the rational answer to a panic nobody had predicted. It should have been celebrated. It was quietly overlooked instead by an industry already chasing the next novelty before this one had been properly understood. That oversight would define everything that followed. On the 11th of August, 1972, the federal government of Nigeria and Automobiles Peugeot of France signed a joint venture agreement. The result was Peugeot Automobile Nigeria, known as PAYN, established at the Kakuri Industrial Estate in Kaduna, northern Nigeria. Vehicle production began on the 14th of March 1975. This was not a goodwill gesture. It was a commercial decision driven by one undeniable fact. The 504 had already proven itself on Nigerian roads before a single factory was built there. The demand was real. The plant was built to meet something that already existed. Within the first 10 years, 342,000 cars had rolled out of Kaduna. The 504 became the official vehicle of the Nigerian civil service. Government employees were expected to drive one, and your professional standing could genuinely be questioned if you didn't. It was nicknamed, without irony, the Nigerian car. Across West Africa, the 504 was doing something no marketing department could have engineered. In Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Benin, Mali, it became the architecture of the bush taxi network, routes with no bus service, towns connected by nothing except a driver with a vehicle and the willingness to make the journey. Drivers chose it because it lasted. Passengers trusted it because it arrived. Mechanics kept it alive because its systems were legible. No proprietary diagnostic equipment, no electronic barriers locking out the uninitiated. In places where the nearest authorized service center was half a country away, that was the difference between a working livelihood and a broken one. Here is the detail that deserves a moment of proper attention. In parts of West Africa, the informal word for any shared passenger vehicle became functionally interchangeable with the 504 itself. Not the brand, not taxi, the specific model. A vehicle earns that status only when it has saturated a culture so completely that it moves past being a product and becomes part of the furniture of daily existence. Think about how many years of consistent, unglamorous reliability it takes to earn that kind of embedding. It cannot be bought. It can only be accumulated journey by journey across years. Europe was busy deciding the 504 was no longer exciting enough. Africa was naming its transport system after it. The East African Safari Rally is not a race in the way most people understand racing. Created in Kenya in 1953, originally called the Coronation Safari, marking Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, it was considered from its first edition one of the most punishing automotive events on the planet. Thousands of kilometers of unprepared African terrain, dirt tracks turning to deep mud, corrugated roads shaking vehicles apart bolt by bolt if the engineering wasn't deep enough to hold. Manufacturers entered it to prove something European circuits couldn't verify. Winning at a closed track proved your car was fast. Winning in East Africa proved it was real. Peugeot had history here already. The 404 had won the event outright in 1963, and again in 1966, 1967, and 1968. The same year, the 504 launched. Now it was the 504's turn to carry that reputation forward. On the 27th of March 1975, Ove Anderson and Arne Hertz took the outright win at the Safari Rally in Nairobi in a 504 Ti. That same year, Hanu Mikola and co-driver Jean Todt, later one of the most powerful figures in global motorsport, won the Rallye du Maroc. Simultaneously, the car swept the Bandama Rally in Côte d'Ivoire. 3 major African rally victories in a single season. The motorsport press gave the car a name it has never lost, the Queen of Africa. In 1978, Jean-Pierre Nicolas and Jean-Claude Lefebvre won the Safari Rally again in 5-6 coupe form. The same car claimed the top 2 positions at the Bandama Rally that same year. Back-to-back Safari victories, continued dominance across every major event on the continent. A vehicle competing in the world's most demanding endurance rally was winning not despite being a production-derived family saloon, but partly because of it. The same qualities that made a bush taxi driver in Dakar choose it over everything else were the qualities that allowed it to outlast purpose-built competitors on rally stages. Word travels differently in motorsport than in advertising. A result outside Nairobi in the mud cannot be argued with. By the late 1970s, the European car market had developed a particular kind of hunger, not for durability, not for mechanical honesty, for the sensation of advancement. Buyers wanted to feel that the future had arrived in their driveway, and the industry was entirely willing to provide that feeling, whether or not it was attached to anything genuinely superior. Front-wheel drive was becoming fashionable, not because engineers had universally agreed it was better, but because it felt modern. Dashboards with more switches, features that could be pointed at across a showroom floor. The 504 had independent suspension, a Pininfarina body, a diesel option that made complete rational sense, and a rally record that should have been the envy of every product manager in the industry. What it didn't have was novelty, and in a European showroom in 1980, novelty had become almost indistinguishable from value. Peugeot ended French production in July 1983. The product cycle had run its course. In a narrow commercial sense, that was accurate. But here is what the product cycle didn't account for. The 504 pickup and estate variants had by this point become operationally essential across sub-Saharan Africa. In Angola, in Chad, in Sudan, organizations delivering food, medicine, and logistical support in territories where infrastructure had been destroyed were choosing the 504 for one reason: it could be repaired in the field. Spare parts moved through informal networks spanning an entire continent. A vehicle that broke down in a remote location and couldn't be fixed locally wasn't an inconvenience for those operations. It was a crisis. The 504 almost never created that crisis. That is a form of value that never appears in a European sales chart. It lives in the decisions of logistics coordinators working in conditions where the wrong choice cost lives rather than money. On one side of the world, the 504 is being retired because consumers want something newer. On the other, the same vehicle is being actively chosen because nothing else performs as reliably where it matters most. Same car, 2 completely different verdicts, and only one was based on what the machine could actually do. If this is the kind of history you come here for, subscribe right now, hit that bell, and drop a comment below telling me whether you drove one, rode in one, or simply remember seeing them everywhere. And if this is connecting with you, send it to someone who remembers when cars were built to last, because what the industry chose as its direction from this point forward is the part that should make you genuinely angry. There is a concept the automotive industry does not advertise. It doesn't appear in launch events or lifestyle campaigns. The concept is planned obsolescence. And in the car industry, it reached a particular maturity through the 1980s and 1990s that permanently altered the relationship between a person and the vehicle they owned. The logic is clean from a business perspective. A car that lasts 25 years doesn't generate a replacement sale for 25 years. A car that develops expensive dealer-dependent faults at year 8 produces a new finance agreement, a fresh insurance policy, and eventually another purchase. The industry built cars whose complexity was specifically calibrated to require specialist intervention that the average owner and the average independent mechanic simply could not provide without proprietary tools and manufacturer-held diagnostic software. You didn't truly own the car, you leased access to it through the dealer network for precisely as long as the manufacturer decided parts would remain available. The 504 existed in a completely different world. When Pan in Nigeria finally closed its line in 2006, it did so not because the car had failed. It closed because the global supply of knockdown kit components had become impossible to sustain commercially. Jean-Pierre Vieux, Peugeot's chief of operations for Africa at the time, stated plainly, they could have kept production running another year or two. The demand was still there. The supply chain had simply reached its limit. In 1998, 30 years after the original Paris Motor Show launch, Nigeria alone recorded over 4,000 new 504 sales in a single year. Argentina kept production running until 1999, with the model ranked among the country's top 5 best-selling cars. Total global production reached 3.7 million units, the most produced Peugeot model in history, behind only the 205. These are not the numbers of a failure. These are the numbers of a car quietly abandoned by the part of the world that invented it, while the part of the world that genuinely needed it kept building it for as long as physically possible. The communities across West Africa that had built their entire transport economy around the 504 were given no transition plan, no replacement program, no acknowledgement that a manufacturing decision made in France would reverberate through the daily lives of taxi drivers in Lagos and market traders in Dakar. The car simply stopped, and the people who had trusted it most completely were left to manage the consequences entirely alone. That is what progress looks like when it is defined exclusively by the people selling it. Europe is rediscovering the Peugeot 504, not through nostalgia campaigns, through the market and the quiet mechanism of people deciding what something is worth when the hype has cleared and only the object remains. The coupe and cabriolet variants, also Pininfarina designed, built between 1969 and 1983, are now legitimate collector cars with values that have climbed consistently into the 20s. Modern Peugeot's own designers acknowledge it. The E-Legend concept pays direct homage to the 504's proportions. The company that retired it in 1983 now uses it as a reference for its vision of the future. That is not irony, that is a confession. Across West Africa today, mechanics have spent entire careers mastering a car not in production for nearly 2 decades, yards full of donor vehicles stripped to keep others running, a functioning informal economy built entirely on the survival of a machine the world officially decided was finished in 1983. We live in an era of cars that update their own software overnight. We also live in an era of record numbers of people who cannot afford to maintain the car in their own driveway. Independent mechanics, the people who kept working-class transport alive with knowledge and hand tools, are being excluded from the repair ecosystem by proprietary systems designed to make independence impossible. The 504 was the opposite of that system. It placed reliable transport within reach of people across 2 continents for nearly 4 decades, without demanding anything more than basic mechanical competence and parts not locked behind a franchise agreement. That is the difference between a tool and a product, between something built for the person using it and something built for the company selling it. If you watch the garage at the end of the road close, if you remember when an honest mechanic could fix most of what went wrong on a Saturday morning, and you already understand what was lost. And if you're younger, the 504 was evidence that a different set of priorities was possible, that it is possible to build something excellent, honest, and enduring without engineering dependency into every component. Remember a saloon car from 1968. It won a rally in 1975 and again in 1978. The last one left a line in Nigeria in 2006. Across West Africa, it became the word for car itself. Ask honestly what we traded that for. Subscribe right now. This kind of history never makes the headlines. Hit like if this story earned it. Leave a comment. Tell me if you drove one, if your father drove one, or what you think we lost when reliability stopped being enough. Send this to someone who remembers when cars were built to last. The 504 refused to die. Make sure this story doesn't either.